Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Lise Howard. I'm a professor of government and foreign service at Georgetown University, and currently serving as the president of the Academic Council on the UN System, ACUNS. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for coming to this second plenary session of our annual meeting. The title of our session is Bridging the Policymaking Research Divide in International Relations, the launch of the Global Governance Innovation Network. A word about ACUNS. The mission of ACUNS is to unite scholars, students, practitioners, policymakers, institutions, and individuals who are active in the work in the study of the UN. ACUNS stimulates and supports dialogue and research about issues of global concern and international cooperation. In fulfilling that mission, as with many professional associations in academia, we have for more than 30 years been engaging in our annual meetings, and this year we're celebrating the 25th anniversary of our flagship peer-reviewed journal, Global Governance. And now what we're talking about today launches us into new territory. This initiative is bringing together ACUNS with its partners, the Stimson Center, which is spearheading this whole thing, Plataforma CIPÓ in Brazil, and Leiden University in the Netherlands. So with these four partners together, we are today launching this very exciting Global Governance Innovation Network, uniting policymakers, scholars, in understanding and how to better understand how to govern our world. I will note that this enterprise, the GGIN, is being spearheaded by my colleague and friend and the amazing Richard Poncio. Richard is a senior fellow and director of the Stimson Center's Global Governance, Justice, and Security Program. He is the author of numerous influential reports and books, and he just had a piece yesterday in Past Blue, co-authored with Christina Petku about his report that he's launching later on today. So if you should check out his piece in Past Blue. Richard's career has spanned think tanks, the US Department of State, and the United Nations, and I'm so pleased to be here with him today. Thank you so much, Richard. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lise, and thank you for your inspiring leadership of ACUNS. It's truly an honor to be a part of the opening day of the 2021 ACUNS annual meeting, only a few short days before Charter Day. And a special thanks to our panelists for contributing to this kickoff event for the Global Governance Innovation Network. As you'll soon hear in this session, among the chief motivations for the network's founding co-sponsors was to both revisit and refresh the ACUNS community's longstanding commitment to bringing world-class scholarship together with international policymaking to address fundamental global governance challenges, threats, and opportunities. Put another way, as Lise wrote in her message to our community in last Friday's monthly ACUNS bulletin, the network moves us a bit out of the scholarly comfort zone of academic meetings and publishing and into the policy world of e-dialogues and policy-oriented publications, end quote. More specifically, through policy research on the underlying causes and dynamics of the anti-multilateralist turn in many countries, and the development of institutional, policy, legal, and normative improvements in the global governance architecture, the GGIN will convene and amplify the voices of a new generation of scholars, policy researchers, and practitioners from the global South and North, alongside established experts and UN mission and secretariat representatives. Specifically, the network will focus on analyzing and responding to gaps across the following four global governance thematic headings: post-COVID recovery and the future of global economic and social governance, rethinking the UN's approach to peace and security, as well as humanitarian action, strengthening rules-based governance, human rights and inclusive governance, and finally, climate governance, the Paris Agreement and beyond. Just a few of the ways we hope the Global Governance Network will engage many of you and your institutions around the world are, first, through policy briefs and longer reports that will highlight diverse writings on topics that stimulate debate and influence post-UN 75 follow-through and wider policy discussions on innovating future global governance structures, including through well thought out strategies for change. Secondly, through periodic e-consultations, a robust social media presence, and a future interactive online knowledge platform. We will hope to inspire and forge this online community of practice to facilitate a regular dialogue between scholars, policy researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. And finally, through an ongoing series of global and regional policy dialogues, we will convene established public intellectuals, former statespersons, and seasoned policymakers and practitioners, alongside a new generation of scholars and policy researchers from the Global South and North, who are all committed to understanding and addressing major gaps in global governance. So thank you for your interest and hopefully getting involved in the activities of this new network. And to take our conversation forward now on the related theme of bridging the policy-making research divide in international relations, I'm delighted to introduce my GGIN partner, Dr. Adriana Abdennour, co-founder and executive director of Plataforma CIPÓ. Adriana.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, Lise, as well. It's great to see everybody and so many here for the launch of this very special innovation network. Hello from Rio de Janeiro, and I wanted to emphasize, first of all, congratulate also Lise and her team for organizing such an innovative format at such a difficult time. It's really great that we can keep the conversation going. As Richard and Lise have already mentioned, we are putting together this network and hoping that it will not only grow quantitatively, but really ascend qualitatively in order to promote knowledge production about global governance, but also improve policy uptake and make it more democratic. And that includes, of course, knowledge production on the UN system and other parts of global governance by Global South scholars. We are a new think tank here based in Brazil. We started under lockdown over a year ago. And as a new Global South institution, we've already encountered many of the hurdles not only in terms of knowledge production, but especially policy uptake and the need to decolonize studies about global governance. So we're very happy to also see that despite these hurdles, there are many new channels opening up, for instance, due to the UN 75 process and what's coming afterwards. I'm going to say a little bit about the format of today's event. We have a 75-minute plenary session. And what we're going to do is rounds of questions. We've pre-prepared a couple of questions for each of our esteemed panelists, but we're also going to try to leave enough room towards the end to collect some questions and comments from the audience. And please feel free to also place them in the chat. We'll be organizing them and relaying them to the participants. I'm going to very briefly introduce the main speakers. I suspect that you already know them, but if you want to find out more, we also have more information on the ACUNS Annual Meeting portal. So we're very pleased to have Dr. Marie McAuliffe, who's the head of Migration Research Division at the International Organization for Migration. We have Professor Tom Weiss, who's presidential professor at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. And he's also the former president and executive director of ACUNS, so possibly the best institutional memory that we have. Very lucky to have you here too. And finally, we have our colleague, Professor Joris Larik, who's an assistant professor of comparative EU and international law. Has been doing very innovative work at Leiden University, and he's also a senior advisor at Stimson Center. We're also going to have joining us for a brief time and through a recording today, Professor Ibrahim Gambari. Unfortunately, due to other commitments, he's unable to join us live, but we managed to pre-record an answer to one of our questions. And of course, he is now Chief of Staff to Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari. He's also the founding chairman of the Savannah Center for Diplomacy, Democracy and Development in Abuja. And he's the former UN's Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, as well as former Foreign Minister of Nigeria. So we have really an amazing group here today with us. And with that, I am going to start by posing the first question to Professor Tom Weiss, and then we'll go through the speakers and we'll include a short video with Professor Gambari's question. Okay, so Tom, if I may, you were ACUN's second executive director beginning in 1992, and under your leadership then, as well as when you served as president of ACUNS, which was I think over a little over a decade ago, you were known for engaging ACUNS members as well as the community as a whole in the policy space, whether you were in New York and Geneva, Washington, or other capitals. So what were, in your perspective, some of the more notable activities in this regard? And today, with our launch of the GGIN, the Global Governance Innovation Network, we'd be really grateful for one or two concrete lessons or insights that you may want to share with our audience. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Adriana, and thanks to Lise and Richard for the invitation. As you mentioned, I'm now what passes for institutional memory. So let me start with a bit of that. Being as long in the tooth as I am, has the advantage of being a back of the envelope historian. So in 1991 and 1992, I think it's worth going back because at the moment I took over as executive director, a topic that I had analyzed and worked on from grad school surprisingly was suddenly popular. I was no longer a voice crying in the wilderness. It was a little reminiscent of the current moment in the United States with Linda Thomas Greenfield saying, oh, multilateralism is back. However, not even 20 years prior to that, my dissertation was actually the only one in the United States that had either international organization or United Nations in the title. So the founders of ACUNS, the first ED, Jean Lyons at Dartmouth, my colleague Ben Rivlin, Elise Boulding, who at the time was at Colorado, Larry Finkelstein, who had been at in San Francisco, my own mentor, Lee Gordenker, Ernie Haas, a whole series of other people had decided that they had not procreated. I was a kind of illegitimate offspring, as was John Ruggie, who had finished a year earlier. But in 1987, at the first conference in New York, there were frankly almost no jobs in the academy. There were very few publications outlets. Those of you who don't go back to the year I was born should recall that when IO, International Organization, was created, it was supposed to focus on the UN and other European institutions. And actually practitioners occasionally had a subscription. It was then captured by the regime theorists, and never a practitioner appeared in the pages, and certainly none subscribed. To say that there were knowledge gaps would be kind. And then suddenly, ACUNS timing is everything. In very rapid order, you have Gorbachev, you have Reagan giving away to George Bush and a new world order, 5 new peacekeeping operations in the backyards of the superpowers, the first Gulf War, and the first UN Chapter 7 operation since Korea. The Soviet Union implodes, Russia joins the Security Council, humanitarian intervention in Somalia, and I take over ACUNS. Well, that's quite a list, but alas, and here's where I'm going to start providing a bit of advice, too many of us spoke about a UN renaissance. In retrospect, it seems that unlike Bill Clinton, I was not only smoking, but inhaling and using some of this rhetoric. At that time, Boutros Ghali's first report that appeared in June of 1992, I actually thought the Gideon Society had adopted it, and I might even find it in a hotel room. It was everywhere. There were monies chasing ideas. But from that giddy moment, there was nothing that the UN could not do. And then suddenly, 2 years later in Rwanda, there was nothing the UN could do. Then in 1999, when I was stepping down, we had either the annus mirabilis or horribilis in Timor and Kosovo. And this roller coaster ride continues. If you want to end up with Trump and then Biden, you have the roller coaster ride continuing. Yet there's one given that remains, and it's why this innovation network is important. Despite the fact that 2 of the 4 topics, climate and the pandemic, and the clock is ticking, the arguments for multilateralism and the UN in particular remain a tough sell. And as Richard mentioned, not just in Washington. And so it's really, in thinking through this history, it's totally unlike what I see as actually the pinnacle of global governance, the United Nations Alliance from 1942 to 45, and the preparations for San Francisco, when multilateralism actually was the solution that was in everyone's minds. So I'm not going to go through ACUNS milestones. We can do that in questions. The journal, the summer workshops, sabbatical programs for UN officials. But you asked me, Adriana, for a couple of pieces of advice. So let me do that in my couple of minutes that remain here. So lesson 1, ACUNS can make a difference. This global governance innovation network can make a difference. If we look at the publications market, we look at the jobs that are available in universities, it's a totally different landscape. But more especially efforts to get people with dirty bureaucratic fingernails to participate. If they're part of the exercise, we need to keep in mind the wildly differing rewards and needs of scholars and practitioners. You can't just throw in a practitioner or 2 and stir the pot. I recall when I was ISA president and I was trying to involve practitioners and a special issue of the journal, I volunteered to chair a panel with a couple of young academics. And I got a special representative of the Secretary General to come, who had just stepped down, to comment. After the first 2 papers, he grabs my sleeves and yanks on it and says, "Tom, who the hell is Antonio Gramsci?" And this was the point of departure for 2 papers. He had no clue, and neither had the 2 younger academics. So practitioners need concrete hooks on which to hang experiences, not either old or new abstractions. The second lesson I would take from all of this is we can't extrapolate from today's headlines. It's fun to go back and look at the 3rd edition of Hedley Bull's classic Anarchical Society. And a former student of Bull's, that is Andy Hurl, lamented the relentless presentism of social science. Narrowing one's intellectual and practical scope to take inspiration and lessons only from the most recent experiences is myopic. It limits the range of innovation, policymaking, and breadth of understanding about contemporary issues. And at worst, it leads to repeating mistakes. So these days, the long term seemingly is defined as the next public opinion poll or RFP from some foundation. And so my second lesson, or second piece of advice, is to pause, take a deep breath, and take history seriously. Thanks, Adriana.
Thanks so much, Tom. It's really amazing to hear from a first-hand participant how little there was back then when you first started. And maybe we'd even take for granted the channels that do exist now. So it's great to hear about the evolution, or at least the changes within these spaces, even if they, from what you have said, it seems like they were very much dominated by Northern actors. We're going to now hear from the other side, so to speak, or the other side of this bridge, which is the policymaking side. Dr. McAuliffe, as a UN official, where have you seen scholars and policy researchers making the most significant contributions to on-the-ground positive change? And here we're referring to whether it's issues related to migration and human development, or for instance, related to displacement in the context of climate change, conflict, or other threats to basic human rights, well-being, and dignity. We'd be very grateful if you could share 1 or 2 examples, as did Tom in your response. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Adriana, and thanks so much to Lise, also to Richard for the invitation to join the panel. Thanks so much. Really, I will be echoing, I guess, some of Thomas's remarks, really in regards to incentive structures and the way in which policy spheres and scholarly spheres operate. They are distinctly different, and they have to be. There are different objectives, different outputs, different forms of communication, and so forth. So it's not easy, and that's why we're here, and that's why we're launching the network today, because there does need to be a lot more specific interventions that are designed to try and bridge the policy research divide in all different sort of spheres. It's certainly an area that I have worked in for quite some time, both at the national level, when I was in the Australian government, and then with the Australian National University, working in this kind of area, particularly around migration and displacement, but also at the international level with the International Organisation for Migration, which I'm very privileged to be working for. There are kind of two examples that really come to mind. One is at the macro level, the global level, but you can have quite substantive impact and influence if you are trying to create the right spaces and the right platforms to enable the research community to engage with policymakers in different areas. And then I'd like to share just some examples and some insights in regards to the micro level, and really talking about here what's going on at the local level in regards to migration and displacement. So one quite recent example was the Migration Research Leaders Syndicate that was established during the consultation and intergovernmental negotiation phases for the UN's Global Compact on Safe, Orderly, Regular Migration, which, as many know, was finalised at the end of 2018 and adopted by UN member states. So in 2017, the syndicate was established. It was convened to enable high quality, very technical expertise, so deep knowledge, to be fed directly into the development of the Global Compact. The syndicate comprised of 36 of the world's leading migration scholars from around the world. So they brought with them geographic, disciplinary, but also gender diversity, which was particularly important to ensure that we're not just talking about, destination countries and the global north, so to speak, as well. We tailored the outputs for a policy audience, and this is again is reiterating what Thomas has already mentioned. It's not that useful in terms of uptake to bring a 8,000 word, beautifully polished, highly finessed, double-blind peer-reviewed academic article, piece of white literature into a policy space. But it is very effective to bring in blogs that have been written of tens of thousands of words, of deep thought, of polished research and analysis. It's also important to bring insights in regards to top 3 reads. So we brought with us, with the syndicate members, we asked them for their top 3 reads that policymakers had to actually read before they went into consultations and negotiations, what was really critically important. We asked them to provide short technical papers, so really limiting down to kind of 2,500 words, writing in clear language, providing an executive summary, making sure that it's accessible, that it's able to be utilised in a policy environment. But we also, to write is not enough. So we also invited them to be participating as thematic experts, as special rapporteurs during the consultation phase, for example, the thematic consultations, and also to engage in panel discussions in the margins of the intergovernmental negotiations that occurred during the formulation of the compact. Now, the syndicates were also fed straight into the negotiation process via the co-facilitators, Switzerland and Mexico. So we were able to bring to them the various outputs, brief the co-facilitators, take that forward in regards to the intergovernmental negotiations, and so they could reach out and explore some of the technical aspects. And interestingly, some of those aspects went to social protection of migrant workers, which of course is reflected in the final compact text, along with issues related to combating migrant smuggling, combating human trafficking, certainly in regards to social security portability, in regards to alternative pathways for migrants, and certainly in regards to return and reintegration. So we can see that there are some aspects within the Global Compact that you would quite rightly expect, but there are some technical aspects that certainly the syndicate was able to bring to bear during the intergovernmental negotiations as well. Now at the micro level, and this relates again to the kind of incentive structures and the way that different systems and spheres work. But we know that long-term systemic biases do operate within the research communities. It's more than just the research community, of course, it's much more widely. But we know that there are eligibility limitations around research funding, for example. I sit on, like many of us sit on funding boards, for example, and you have quite tight limitations on eligibility of institutions, of individual principal researchers and so forth. But we also know in terms of the publishing environment that there are strong kind of barriers and obstacles related to accessing publishing. And we're seeing this in some situations through open access regimes and the costs involved in publishing within the scientific community. So we can see that while there are some limitations around publishing of research, I think the UN is particularly well placed to be able to provide alternatives to that, while also enabling very strong quality assurance mechanisms such as peer review. So having things published in the so-called literature and having them published open access does not necessarily mean that you need to diminish the quality review processes, for example. And in the current edition of the World Migration Report, we analysed a sample of migration data.
Dr. McAuliffe, I think we're having problems with the quality of the sound.
Major storm overhead. Everything is banging too. Sorry. There's a major storm going on just over Geneva, so you might not be able to hear me. Can you hear me now?
We're getting a lot of breaking up of the mic.
Yeah, I think it's due to the storm. We've got a big electrical storm going overhead. So maybe we'll see if it passes and maybe I can return. Thanks.
We'll come back to you. We'll definitely come back.
Sorry about the weather.
Not at all. So thank you very much. It's very important to point out the importance of these tailored outputs. Sometimes those coming from a pure research background, they're not yet accustomed to the language and the formats that are used in the policy world. Here in Brazil, we've been talking about the need for policy writing courses, and we're starting to do this actually through CIPÓ, but it should be part of, I think, of a broader project of translating materials, and then of course identifying policy uptake channels. And it sounds like the facilitators, the co-facilitators were very crucial in the syndicate example. So thank you very much. Now we have a question for Joris Lark, who's been doing really interesting work, especially because he's based in Europe and thinking about the EU. So Joris, the past years, rules-based governance has come under a lot of pressure from various sides, and I know you've been writing about this. As an academic who focuses on international law, but who's also very active in policy advice, what can we learn from this very challenging period?
Yeah, so that's well. First of all, thanks Adriana and to ACUNS for this wonderful online conference, and it's also an honor to be on a panel like this and to be launching the Global Governance Innovation Network. Maybe that's one of the lessons. Maybe the main lesson of that period is that we need something like the GGIN to bring these different communities stronger together and kind of, in a way, stand up for rules-based global governance, because global governance, I think, without international law is hardly thinkable. But to also get more academics out of the ivory tower and learn exactly the things. So in a way, I can skip over a couple of lessons, because I think Marie McAuliffe has mentioned some of the very important ones that we see here in The Hague as well. Maybe as a sign of a note of optimism. So here, at least in The Hague, another UN city, famous for international law, at least we see it's a difficult road to come together with policymakers, but we've made some important steps towards it. So actually, I'm part of our newest department of Leiden University, which is called the Faculty of Governance and Global Affairs, which is in The Hague for that reason, to be even closer to the international organizations, but also the Dutch government, foreign ministry in particular. And yeah, we have started working together more closely these past years. But yeah, it is not just kind of mixing them together, I think, as Professor Weiss said, but it takes a lot of time building trust, learning each other's language. And yeah, in a way, walking this tightrope between, on the one hand, you got to be able to communicate your academic expertise indeed in these more compact, understandable formats, but that still has to be based on very serious research. So you have to be able to do both, exist and survive in the peer review arena, but then also be able to translate that to policymakers. At the same time, it's also important that policymakers and officials come out of, and not, we don't call it the ivory tower, but they're different office buildings, but I think there we also see progress here, at least in The Hague. So some of that I want to take into the GGIN and also benefit from the other lessons that we've that were presented, and also just from, I think, inspirational people that are on this panel here as well, that are exactly the kind of scholars that don't hide in the ivory tower, as well as practitioners that are very solid also in terms of their academic credentials and able to process academic thinking as well. Maybe more specifically, but I don't want to take up too much time. You will keep hearing from us anyway, and the GGIN in the coming weeks and months and hopefully years. But maybe specifically on rules-based governance and the more recent period. So yeah, I think global governance and rules-based governance has proven more resilient maybe than a lot of people would have given it credit for. There's certainly a lot of time and again it's been claimed to be dead, and certainly certain politicians and administrations have tried to kill it, but somehow it won't die. So I think that gives us some hope and optimism. Maybe one thing to point out as an example there is especially the onslaught against rules-based governance that we could see in the form of the America First policy of the Trump administration, to some extent also Brexit, if we see that as a renunciation of at least one particular part of very rules-based regional governance, is that even when this was going on, these states still play very much by the rules. So I thought that was in a way reassuring and to some extent amazing. It kind of takes me back to the famous Lewis Henkin quote that whatever you may say about international law and however much you may bash it and how ineffective it is, and it doesn't really matter, you can see here also states abiding by it and by its procedures really most of the time. So yes, we could see many angry tweets about the Paris Climate Agreement and the WHO and the UN Human Rights Council, but then US never really walked away from any of these things. Withdrawal procedures were initiated, notices were respected for terminating these treaties, for instance. Some of them didn't actually manage to become effective before the new administration under Joe Biden took office. I think that's the case for the WHO withdrawal, that just could be cancelled. And even with all the vitriolic Brexit campaign and rhetoric that we've seen, we saw the British government at each stage, at every moment, complying with the long, drawn-out, difficult Article 50 procedure in the EU, and they never really turned its back on global governance, I think, more largely. So I think that's something, a lesson and then some solace we can take from that. At the same time, though, in that period, we could also see a lot more actors standing up much more vocally for global governance and the rules-based order. So I think it really forced countries like the Alliance for Multilateralism, that's a big global group, and fortunately not just the Global North Club, to speak out a bit more, not just rely on the US all the time, because I think we are really very clearly moving away from a system where you can just, if ever that was the case, just rely on the United States to fix it and bear the torch. So in that sense, I think that was one positive way to look at it. Is it's been really a wake-up call. It anticipates, I think, a much more multipolar, multi-actor world order. So if you want to keep rules-based global governance alive and updated, then that's an enterprise that has to rest on many shoulders. And again, bringing together different communities as well. not just state officials, but also non-state actors and the scholars. So again, that brings us back to why GGIN, what motivates us in setting up this network. Maybe one additional point, but then I'll wrap it up at that, is to come back to the point of inclusiveness, which is very important to GGIN and the global, the now North-South divide, as well as other forms of inclusivity as well. So I think that GGIN can also make an important difference that needs to be made. And in that sense, I think some of the scholarship that we've seen recently bashing international law, if I can call it that, and maybe to me, always international lawyers is one of the most insecure groups of people I know. If you think of scholarhood, it's half the time is international law really law, and now more recently it's international law really international, and but it's good to some extent. It's really a very critical reckoning of the origins of international law and how we can become more aware of that and also take international law forward. So for me, this is very much an enterprise in making also international law fit for purpose. Again, for the 21st century. So to kind of leave a lot of let's say, the baggage from the past behind. Just first of all, you have to recognize it, you have to problematize it, discuss it. But the ultimate goal is certainly not to cancel international law, just as no other national or regional law is going to be canceled, but really it's a necessary exercise to make sure that international law can play this important role that it does in global governance also in the 21st century. And I think that's one of the important parts that we hope to push with the GGIN as well. I'll leave it at that because I do very much want to hear from the other panelists as well and anticipate and look forward to the questions in the debate. So for now, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Joris. And it's great that you mentioned, this is a careful balance that many of us try to strike between our policy work and our more academic, traditional publishing and going through peer review. And of course, the expectations in the two worlds are very different. So I see a lot of our colleagues sharing this challenge, but it's also an activity that can immensely enrich at a personal level, both sides of the coin. And then also thank you for mentioning these broad geopolitical and political wind shifts in which we operate, and we try to accompany and to analyze global governance. We're not just looking at the institutions within a vacuum, but we have to really grasp what's going on more broadly. And for those of you interested in European matters, I really recommend that you follow Joris Larik on Twitter. It's one of my best sources of analysis of what's going on from a European perspective. Now we have a question for Dr. Gambari. I'm going to pose the question and Christina is going to play the video of his response, which we recorded on Saturday. So Professor Gambari, while a scholar of training who has founded a very respected international think tank in your home country of Nigeria, the Savannah Center, you've spent a majority of your career in the senior echelons of the United Nations, as well as in the government of Nigeria. So drawing on your personal and professional experience, what would you say are one or two of the most important ways in which scholars and researchers can contribute and hopefully are continuing to contribute, not just in the past, to shaping global policy agendas advanced by the United Nations and other international bodies? And also, do you have, following up on what Joris just said, any particular lessons for Global South scholars?
Well, I'm very pleased to actually join this annual meeting of the Academic Council on UN United Nations system, as well as being on at a time when we are launching the new global governance initiative network, which actually build upon the efforts we've been making since the Global Governance Forum and the series of conversations we've had on global and regional initiatives and conversations on the issues that concern the world. And of course, for me, the origin was in 2015 when I was privileged and honored to serve with my friend and long-term colleague, Malden Albright, as co-chairs of the Commission on Global Security, Justice, and Governance, which we titled at that point, the report was titled Confronting or the Crisis of Global Governance. I say this because at that time, if you look at the headlines in the world, you had not only violent conflicts, but also the rise of nationalism, nativism, and in effect, the coming into power of leaders who propose simplistic solutions to very complex issues and try to divide rather than to unite. Now, fortunately, one of the issues that the international community rallied around was the issue of climate change. And that was a recognition that no country, big or small, rich or poor, powerful or not, can address these issues by themselves. And it requires really cooperation, global cooperation in order to address them. Since then, of course, we have had the Paris Climate Agreement, which sadly was not binding, and even more of concern that the commitment being made by member states of the United Nations signatories really have not met the kind of needs that addressing and confronting the challenge of climate change would require. Now, since then, of course, the issues that we had raised in our report has become exacerbated by COVID-19, so that in addition to this, we will have the economies of the world contracting. My own country, Nigeria, really experienced 2 recessions, almost back to back, and we're only gradually recovering, very fragile recovery out of recession. But the bottom line is that really academic communities, scholars all over the world, especially from our part of the world, really need to be engaged creatively, coming up with new ideas, new approaches to really influence national actors, global actors, so that they can address many of these challenges in a way in which will be a durable solution, in ways in which also in which the international community can act as one. Now, of course, now we have UN 75 and at 75, and the Secretary General's report, our common agenda is coming up. So it provides another opportunity for scholars to enter the policy debate, to make contributions, scientific as well as policy specific policy recommendations to address the needs for cooperation and interaction and the mainstreaming of ideas and issues that emanate really from bottom up, from the grassroots up to the national level, up to the regional, continental level, and the global levels. And as a political scientist, I know that power is never given. You have to seize it. So the impact of our contribution as scholars must be that made in a very pushful manner. We have to inject ourselves into the policy debate. At Savannah Center, which had the privilege to have founded and headed until my current appointment, really became a platform. And I recall very well when the then Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, United States, Linda Greenwood, who is currently the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, called for a meeting of the African think tanks, about 11 of them, to really encourage how African think tanks to make contribution to policy debate and to be partners with the U.S. After all, the U.S. engages with Africa in many sectors, business sectors, governmental, political parties, but not very effectively with African think tanks. That's a recognition of the role that academics and scholars such as assembled here can really play in enriching policy in new directions. For example, we had the Global Compact, which was very much influenced by the contribution of academia that led to that being used as a tool, in my experience, in Angola when I was the head of the United Nations mission in Angola, to how to use that to encourage international oil companies and others who are in the extractive industry to operate in ways that do not exacerbate conflicts, rather in ways that will promote peaceful resolution of conflicts. But I thank you very much for that opportunity to make that contribution.
Well, thank you very much to Dr. Gambari. And we hope that GGIN will be a place where we can think and improve policy dialogue and uptake communications, not only with African think tanks, but also with others around the world, including in the global south, but also that we can form new configurations. There's a lot of eagerness here in our region in Latin America to engage more with African counterparts, even though South-South cooperation currently is not among the top priorities of some of our foreign policy makers. Civil society can take that one step ahead. We have another round of questions for the presenters, and because of time, I'm just going to ask you to try to be as concise as possible. Use your policy language rather than your academic background. So Dr. McAuliffe, our earlier question posed to you was a little bit more backward looking. If we look to the future, and something I know our community would be very keen to hear your thoughts on is, what would you say briefly are 2 or 3 sort of frontier issues that scholars from our community, that is people who want to engage with the UN system more directly, might consider exploring in the next 3 to 5 years?
Thank you very much, Adriana. Can you hear me now? I think the worst of the storm has passed.
I think it has.
Yeah, the noise has calmed down a little bit. So sorry about that before, and sorry about the connection there earlier. In terms of this kind of, I guess, 2 parts. One is related to the what, or the thematic kind of areas, and the other part is really in terms of how. And they are connected in actual fact, because one of the very big challenges that a whole different swathes of policy areas are currently grappling with, and have been for quite some years now, but it has intensified due to COVID-19, is the rapid technological advances to do with increasing digitalization of economic, political, social life. So that's having manifest changes in terms of how we interact around a whole range of different kind of policy processes, from especially in migration and displacement sort of context, right the way through what we call the kind of the migration cycle, from pre-departure to entry to stay and return and so forth. It's creating huge amounts of different outputs and manifestations in regards to inequality, and some are looking very closely at how that is changing and intensifying aspects in regards to the digital divide and inequality. But then on the flip side, COVID-19 has shown us and provided us with a bit of a silver lining to the cloud, no pun intended here, but in regards to the use of digital technology to connect transnationally, as we are doing now. And just one sort of quick example is I'm a member and have been for a number of years of the International Union for the Scientific Study of Populations, and I'm currently on the IUSSP panel on international migration. And at the beginning of the panel, which was a couple of years ago or so, we were trying to use technology to engage with researchers from all around the world, but it wasn't the norm. And what we have seen over the last 18 months is we have seen digital platforms and the way that we are connecting virtually have enormous benefits. We can be having workshops and meetings and have people online from, you know, Mogadishu to Paris to New York to Dakar, to a whole range of different areas. And we are seeing that, notwithstanding the digital divide issues around access to technology, that it has improved, that it has become much more acceptable, even though the technology did exist before. We're seeing growth in technology, but we're seeing it being an accepted form of engagement. And it's certainly one of the things that was reflected in the UN research roadmap on the COVID-19 recovery. And we see this is particularly important in terms of the challenges that digitalization is actually raising in regards to human rights, in regards to privacy, in regards to datification of our worlds and our private lives, as well as our professional lives, but also that it's presenting some opportunities in terms of engaging with civil society, with the research community from all around the world. The last kind of two that have already cropped up in the discussion in terms of the thematic areas, we've heard about them from other speakers, so I won't talk at any length. But the first one, of course, is the intensification of ecologically negative human activity. We often talk about climate change, but it's more than just climate change. It relates to overconsumption, unsustainable economic growth, resource depletion, biodiversity collapse, climate change as well. Broadly, some would put that into the umbrella term of human supremacy. So that is going to continue to be an enormous challenge for the world. And there are a number of different streams of work that are much, much needed in terms of the science being able to inform policy and politics, most importantly. And the last one is the increasing competition between states, which of course has a direct impact on multilateralism as well as on bilateralism and other forms of engagement internationally. Thanks.
Thank you very much, including for noting the importance, of course, of bringing in scientists from other fields. And as we know from the pandemic, that has never been this important. We have a second question for Professor Tom Weiss. So you've just put out a new book, The Third UN, which looks at the role of research communities and networks in shaping UN ideas. So in your view, what are the major gaps and how can policy relevant research as well as uptake be improved, including with respect to scholars from the developing world?
Well, thanks, Adriana. I'm sure that members of the audience will be delighted to learn that wherever they're located, they're part of the Third UN. I'm going to start again with a short bit of history because, and I hope it's not too self-serving, because the whole idea grew out of the UN Intellectual History Project, which I directed with Sir Richard Jolly and Louis Emery, two former very senior UN officials who had also been, like Gambari, in the academy before they went into the UN. And the evidence from that project and 16 university press books and 100 interviews of oral history is that the UN's comparative advantage, and therefore the role for the Global Governance Innovation Network, is in the role of ideas, norms, principles, standards, goal setting, monitoring. So the article, which was actually first published in Global Governance, and the book, which has just come out from Oxford with Tatiana Karayanis as my co-author, has this definition: the ecology of supportive, not the National Rifle Association, but the supportive non-state actors, intellectuals, scholars, consultants, think tanks, NGOs, for-profit, and media that interacts with the UN's intergovernmental machinery and officials. The latter two are what Ines Claude and all of what we were taught as specialists in international relations, an organization called the First UN and the Second UN. When we tried to look at the UN's role as an idea and policy monger, it was not possible by looking only at member states, certainly not by member states, and certainly not only UN officials, but one had to involve everyone else. And I have to give credit to Richard Jolly, who said, when I kept saying, well, what about there's this first UN and second UN, and he says, get out of your straitjacket. Let's look at the facts. So the first lesson, frankly, is we got to set aside our long-standing theoretical baggage, look hard at even our most cherished theories and beliefs, even if we have a reputation built on them. So that the third UN grew out of that. The second lesson, I think, regards the role of scholars from the Global South. Adriana has more sensible things to say about this than I do, but she asked the question. So I'll say that I think the Global Governance Innovation Network should draw upon the spirit of a project and a book that she and I edited called Emerging Powers in the UN. One of the motivations for that effort was to call into question the shibboleths about the developing world and the UN, between the global North and the global South. And I have in mind two particular topics. The first is the category itself. While I personally see the G77 and NAM made sense in the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s, as part of efforts to alter the agenda and raise unpopular issues, with each passing year, frankly, the categories make less and less sense. You can't have a conversation, but this is the only way, seemingly, that the UN system knows how to organize a conversation. So at the risk of being accused of swearing in church, my view is that this binary North versus South needs to disappear and move more to issue-based partners. And that would be the first shibboleth that I'd have the Global Governance Innovation Network look into. The second one is the necessity to monitor, and I'm going to end here, monitor objectively and harshly the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, it's high time to be less politically correct and bashful and be willing to call a spade a shovel. Ideally, the UN itself should do this, but there's no hope in hell they're going to do that because they want to keep all member states happy all the time. But the Global Governance Innovation Network, as a part of the third UN, should lead the charge in such monitoring. You certainly can't rely on what governments report or what they wish to have reported, but rather on what a hard-hitting and independent groups would judge performances. This includes especially SDG 16, which covers the host of governance sins and dirty linen that most countries, North or South, would prefer to ignore and certainly not have exposed. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for bringing up our book. Since we published that, so much has happened and so many issues, some of which do have a north-south divide. Others have become more fragmented, but I was very impressed. I was recently invited to a human rights pillar debate about the right to development, and the voting pattern there definitely follows north-south pattern. So there's a lot for us to research and maybe even to propose new configurations. We're going to take a round of questions from the audience that have been coming in through the chat or direct message, and I'm going to pose 3 of them, and we'll see if we have time for a second round. The first question, I think, is follows up on what Tom just said, and it's from Tom Daly from Citizens for Global Solutions. Could you say a few words about the similarities and differences between the World Government Research Network run by Professors Luis Cabrera of Griffith University, James Thompson of Huron College, and Danielle Deney of Johns Hopkins University versus the GGIN? It would be really useful, Tom, for you to speak briefly about this. We also have another question about treaties, and this is from Laxiri Mendes, who writes, I consider treaties, non-treaty instruments, and implementing legislation to be the most important legal tools to ensure global governance. Has ACUNS undertaken any research on the policies and the implementation processes? Maybe Tom could say something, but maybe yours, you might have something relevant to say. And then we have a question about the thematic areas with which GGIN are starting. So maybe yours, you can also tackle this. Marianne Beisheim from SWP is asking why the themes do not build on the 2030 agenda, but instead focus on post-COVID recovery with economic and social recovery and single out climate governance. If you could just provide the rationale for that initial choice of themes. Anybody would like to go first? We have incoming questions for Marie as well, so we'll wait for the next round.
Do you want me to start, Adriana? I can.
Yes, please, Tom.
This is Tad Daly, with whom I've been having conversations for many years. it's important to keep in mind that, as he knows, that global governance actually grew out of a dissatisfaction with a rather top-down and rigid notion of world government. And in fact, the motivation for global governance and the motivation for the founding of the journal was to try to reflect a couple of things. One, the growing interdependence, not of every issue, but of more and more issues, which really began with the environment in the early 1970s. And the second factor was the growth of actors, every normal kind of actors. The list that I had in the third UN is part of that. But the terms that we use now frequently, network, partners, etc., didn't exist when the notion of a more centralized government grew out of the 30s and right after World War II. So it seems to me that one of the important values is not covered in the World Government Research Network, which is this proliferation of actors and kinds of inputs and get beyond this rather more static notion of somehow a centralized authority, which we're nowhere close to getting or even talking about. And so that, it seems to me, the Global Governance Innovation Networks, the key word is innovation, and trying to figure out what are the best use and the best pooling of resources and energy and actors. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Tom. Joris, would you like to follow up on the questions?
Yeah, sure. And thanks. Thanks. I think they're all great points and questions. Let me start maybe with the one on treaties. I think that's closest to my own expertise, and I'm very glad that that this point was raised, so that it's next to the treaties themselves. So really, the international law itself. Yeah, basically the answer is there. Implementing legislation matters a lot too, but then what matters more broadly is also just the basically the national legal order, in the case of the EU, also that legal order. So the kind of law at the national or regional level that determines what you do with all the international law that you've signed up to. So that's a branch of law that's called foreign relations law. And that's very common and popular in the US, certainly with US lawyers, but I think that still is pretty new to be understood really as an important branch of law in its own right in many other countries, and often where it's not also, well, it's kept a bit separate also from both international lawyers within these countries, as well as just looking at it from a more comparative perspective. So I don't know who else is doing this at ACUNS. I hope they are. Well, I'm doing it, but also the more comparative approach to that's really very new. So that's a project I was involved in. It's called Comparative Foreign Relations Law, under the leadership of Curtis Bradley from Duke Law School. But that's the first time we actually started to look at these things across countries. So how actually can we compare different countries and the way they implement international law? And that's very valuable as well in terms of figuring out also when does it not work out that well. How does it's really one of the weaknesses, I think, in analyzing international law and things that don't work about it. How countries are very happy to sign up to all kinds of treaties, and some are very happy to do that, but then the implementation at the national level is lacking. So this kind of research is very important, but also you have to go beyond law here as well. So I'm very excited also about research that is going on about compliance with international law, where you need to combine law with different social sciences and IR approaches to make more sense of that. So I hope that kind of answered that question, but we certainly need much more of that. So thanks for raising that. Maybe briefly also on Marianne Beisheim's question. I mean, Richard wants to say something about that as well. But to my understanding, the SDGs, given that they're so broad, so also I'm glad that SDG 16 was already mentioned. But I think the SDGs can also be seen as an agenda that can permeate the 4 different priority dimensions that that were identified for the GGIN. So the idea wasn't to just shoehorn them into one particular dimension, but really I think they matter for all 4 of them. And also, yeah, let me also point out here that SDG 16 is very much about also rule of law and good governance at the national level. So it's not that much about international law, but about developing that at the national level, which will also benefit international law and then promoting policies like the SDGs and similar ones, human rights policy, environmental policies, the Paris Agreement, and so forth. Once you have the international agreements, to also make sure they're properly implemented. So that's also how I see primarily one of the main values of SDG 16. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joris. We have more questions coming in for Marie. Let me take the broadest one. Or two. What would you say are the frontier issues in the international migration policy space, and how can scholars contribute more to debates on improved international institutions, law, and norms? Let me add the second question, and that's from Mayara Foli at Plataforma CIPÓ here in Brazil. We also have a question from Adewale Bakare, who's from the Savannah Institute in Abuja, and he asks, can there be effective and inclusive global governance without a world government?
Well, that would be depending on how you define world government, wouldn't it? I think we already don't have a world government as such. We have a kind of like a UN system, but I don't know that people would describe it as a world government as such. It's got some of the hallmarks of governance, but then it's missing the big T on the end there, of course. So I think that one is certainly something that others can more rightfully debate. But in terms of the big kind of policy issues, I mean, there are a number of them in regards to, displacement. Probably the most pressing is related to human supremacy, as I mentioned before, including climate-related migration and displacement. And it is obviously featuring very, very significantly in the minds of policymakers, in the minds of researchers, scientists, social scientists, hard kind of STEM scientists all around the world on these particular kind of issues. And it's a very, very big focus. But there's also, I would say, a number of different ways in which we can engage. And here it's going to more about the GGIN with the emphasis on the N and the network, because there are a number of different initiatives that are occurring around the world on very specific thematic areas, or more broadly around science and policy sort of engagement that we can learn from. And they can be quite small and quite sort of discrete in particular areas, or they can be very substantial and significant in their own rights. But it's about being part of that network and learning about some of the successes, about learning some of the failures, which do transcend different thematic areas, different policy areas, what works, how to engage, what tools can be used around communications, around leverage of very significant bodies of work in the research community. And I think that's where the network has a distinct advantage in terms of drawing on a whole range of different initiatives from around the world. I mean, we're involved and have recently just started work with the Geneva Science Policy Interface, which we're really pleased to be working on with the Global Migration Center at the Graduate Institute. It's a small body of work, but it is looking very directly on a thematic topic around migration, about how policymakers are utilizing information in a digital environment. And again, I come back to the digital environment because what has changed, over my career, the last 35 years, is that we are using material, we're using information, we're using the outputs from science in quite different ways. And we do need to adapt. Not necessarily the kind of production of rigorous, robust research and analysis, but the way that we communicate and engage with different communities, including through digital platforms. So we're really pleased to be working on that, and it'll be a great, I think, resource in terms of the projects that are coming out of the GSPI's current round into the network and sharing those and collaborating in that sort of space. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have a question that I think perhaps Joris could help to answer, and then another migration one. So from Justin Hanner, could you explain a little bit more about the institutional structure of GGIN? Will there be full-time staff, headquarters, etc., or more of a loose peer network? Also, is there any overlap in collaboration with the C4 UN? And for Dr. McAuliffe, considering the existing gaps in knowledge production and data on migration-related dynamics, particularly with regards to new trends such as climate-induced migration, how do you think networks such as GGIN could help to fill this gap so as to have a practical impact on current migration policies and governance? Joris, would you like to tackle the first one?
Sure, I'll try to anyway, but maybe let me also say a word about world government, because it's come up now a few times as well. Just briefly, maybe just more my experience with that term. Again, yeah, with Brexit now the last couple of years, I think maybe one reason certainly why I think GGIN, or why maybe a declared goal of GGIN isn't world government is it's a bit more short and midterm oriented, and that therefore prefers the term governance to just see that certain necessary reforms in the light and in the face of global challenges can be addressed. There's some meaningful change that can happen without getting bogged down into some of the very silly debates we've been having in Europe for many years. Maybe in other parts of the world it's not like that, hopefully, but just to give you two examples, I think why I like to stick away very far from that topic, from that term, because once you start talking about statehood or governance, government, at least in the European context, of course you could have a very nice, meaningful discussion about what's the end point of reforms and closer collaboration and integration, but often you end up in very silly debates. So we had that 2004 with the European Treaty establishing the European Constitution, and a lot of that then all of a sudden hinged on whether there should be a reference to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in that thing, or to the flag. And now most recently with Brexit, a lot of the discussion then turns over these kind of misguided paraphernalia of sovereignty. So stuff like, can you have a blue passport, or can I like a little crown symbol on your beer glass? And that's really the kind of things that I don't want to derail any more meaningful kind of intellectual discussion and policy scholarship exchange about global governance reform. That's really just my personal experience with these things. And background on the GGIN itself. Yeah, so no, certainly we used to be called UN 2020, and now it's a coalition for the UN we need. Yeah, that's been a close partner all along in a lot of our work, and we'll also stay involved. We hope to stay very close to them and involved with them, also with the work of the GGIN. Maybe with another difference being that it's GGIN is, of course, UN is at the heart of global governance also for us, but it looks also a bit beyond that. So it's not just about UN reform. And for the institutional structure, well, just for brevity's sake, I do refer you to our brand new website, once again, which explains that a bit more. Full-time positions, well, let's say I was saying earlier, it's not as bad maybe that there's no jobs in this at all, but there's no full-time positions in it either. I mean, I'd love to work on something like that, much more full-time, but that's not in it right now. But we certainly, that's also why we have this coalition, a multi-partner approach, so that we can bundle our forces and work on this together. But so that we have this kind of critical mass to take this agenda forward.
Thank you, Joris. I think we're going to take sort of the last answer, the last word from Dr. Marie McAuliffe due to time constraints.
Thank you very much, Adriana. It's a great question indeed, and certainly there is a very significant gap in terms of knowledge. There is a strong focus in the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, Regular Migration in terms of especially migration-related data to inform evidence-based policy making. You know, I've been working in this space for decades now, and it's very unusual to have a research and data objective to be right at the top of the list. Usually we're kind of like right down the bottom, usually the last objective, but this one is the first objective. There are a number of reasons for that, and I think it is very well understood that differences exist in regards to capabilities, capacities around the world, that more needs to be done to be supporting through technical assistance and support different areas all around the world. And I think that this is something that the GGIN could certainly assist with as a globally focused network. There are, of course, you know, donors and member states and the multi-partner trust fund supporting the Global Compact on migration working in this area. But of course, there are many more people that need to be supporting and engaging in this particularly critical area, because if we're not collecting, reporting on and analysing even the basic types of data around international migration and displacement, it makes it very difficult, of course, to come up with effective and targeted policy and programmatic sort of solutions. So it's kind of, it is the, you know, the raw materials that are needed in formulating effective responses, of course. So this is where the GGIN, as well as other networks, for example, there is one that has been set up under the UN Migration Networks Aegis, which is the knowledge platform. It's a connection hub that allows for scholars from all around the world to engage and to be part of a community of practice. And it's very similar, I think, to the GGIN, but within the UN type of system. So there's a lot of very good practices that, that can be shared. There's a lot of kind of ways of connecting different people. And I think this is where the GGIN can be particularly useful. Not just from a kind of global north, global south perspective, as we've been talking about, but including that particular challenge in regards to migration data and evidence-based policy making. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And unfortunately, because of the time, we're not going to have enough time for the remaining questions. Many people sent them in, but we are going to collate them so that we have them as a reference for GGIN as well as ACUNS. We encourage you to continue participating in the ACUNS panels and roundtables, beginning again at the top of the hour and also over the next 3 days. And you can consult the ACUNS annual meeting portal for all of the Zoom links as well as the full agenda of the event. So thank you immensely to our panelists. It was a pleasure and an honor to hear from all of you, such different perspectives, very useful advice too for our network members and others who are interested. And we also want to thank the 4 co-sponsors of GGIN. So we have ACUNS, we have our Plataforma CIPÓ here, University of Leiden and the Stimson Center, as well as all participants in today's session. And we look forward to seeing everybody in the other panels and roundtables today and tomorrow and the next couple of days. So thank you very much, and let's all work towards an expanded policy research space. Take care.
Thank you, Adriana. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Obrigada.